So welcome to the smog radio crash course. This will be kind of a 50-foot view of the general theory and I guess general knowledge of radio in lots of different areas. So getting started, we'll be going over a couple of topics, namely ham radio, band propagation, digital modes, hardware, key applications, Meshtastic, and OPSEC. Here we have an image of the electromagnetic spectrum. Visual light or visible light is in this area right here, right? So it's going to be very high frequencies. That's up in the nanometers. And radio is down here in the centimeters and meters. So, yeah. So what is ham radio? Actually, now that I'm saying that, I don't know what ham stands for. But essentially, ham radio is amateur radio. It is the use of radio frequency spectrum for the purposes of non-commercial exchanges of messages, wireless experimentation, self-training, private recreation, radio sport, contesting, and emergency communications. To the right here, we have an image of the radio band plan. So this has all of the different frequencies that a ham operator can use. We'll go over a bunch of these different frequencies later on. So there's 3 licenses. If you look on the right side here, there's actually 5, but 2 of those are have been retired, but they're grandfathered in, so that's why they're listed. The 3 currently are technician, which has full privileges in the VHF UHF, which stands for very high frequency, and ultra high frequency. That is greater than 30 megahertz. They also have limited privileges in HF. So if we look at our chart here, our band plan, and there will be a larger picture of this in the next slide, so I guess we can go over that when we get there. There's the general license, which has privileges on all bands, and it has around 83% of all full privileges of the whole band plan, and amateur extra, that is full privileges on all bands. In order to obtain these licenses, you have to basically go in to a in-person exam. They're hosted by local radio clubs, a whole bunch of old farts host it, and you have to fill out, I think it's 50 questions, something like that. I don't remember. It's basically like 50 or maybe it's 35 multiple choice questions from a pool of a couple hundred for at least for the technician, and then basically the same thing for general. Another couple hundred pool of questions, and if you pass, I think whatever 80% of it or 90%, then you get the license, and it costs, I don't know, $20. It's pretty cheap. It lasts for a long time. I don't remember the exact specifics, but you can go look up if you are interested in getting those licenses. And having those licenses are valuable if you want to use the ham radio. If you do not have these licenses, it is generally illegal for you, according to FCC regulation. It is illegal for you to transmit on any of these frequencies. There are some exceptions, which we'll cover later. But I want to point out that it is legal to transmit on ham frequencies in a life-threatening situation. The FCC wants you to report it, but you can do that if you want. But again, if you're on top of your roof and the flood water is up to your second story and you're about to die, you can get on to your local repeater on 144 megahertz and call for Mayday. It's perfectly legal, and anybody who yells at you for doing that is a sad ham, and we don't like sad hams. Here is the larger picture of that, the band plan that I talked about in the last slide. Let's talk about this stuff on the left here. So actually, if we go up, where is it? Right here. Speed of light, c, E equals mc squared, all sorts of comes up, but it's about roughly 300 times 10 to the 6th meters per second, so super fast. So wavelength is c divided by frequency. Over here, for example, you have 300, which is speed of light, divided by 144 megahertz, which over here is 2 meters, and that gives you 2 meters. So that explains how there's that inverse proportion between frequency and wavelength. Explains why as the wavelength decreases, the frequency increases. And it's a little confusing, and it can be a little hard to wrap your head around initially, especially when people are like, they switch between the frequency, which is what you put into your radio, and then the band, which is in wavelength. And antennas are also in wavelength. So it can get a little confusing. But looking at this chart can really clear things up. So yeah, here we have a picture of a half wavelength antenna. It's made up of 2 quarter wavelength antennas. So let's say that's 144 megahertz antenna. It would be half a meter this way, half a meter that way. So and yeah, over on this this chart right here, there's a couple different categories in terms of UHF, VHF, HF. I guess when they started, they thought that they weren't going to be going much higher than medium frequency, so they called that medium frequency, and that is actually our low frequencies. And then we get into HF, which is high frequencies, and that's from 80 meters up to 10 meters, so 3 to 30 megahertz there. And we'll go over some of the benefits of these wavelengths and some of the drawbacks. And then you have from 30 to 300 megahertz. That's going to be your VHF, so very high frequency. In this case, that's going to be 6 to 1.25 meters. And then your UHF, which is ultra high frequency, and that's going to be 300 megahertz to 3 gigahertz. In most cases, you're just going to be using either 70 centimeter or 33 centimeter. So what are some options we have, I guess, as if you're not a ham operator, let's say, there's the General Mobile Radio Service, the GMRS, and the FRS, Family Radio Service. There's a little bit of a difference, but they use the same frequencies. If you were to go to Walmart and buy a 2-pack walkie-talkie radio, it would come with usually 16 channels is what I don't think they, or maybe 14. I don't think they go into these higher ones, but maybe it'll have 22 channels in it, and you can jump through those, and they work. And what those are doing is broadcasting on these FRS frequencies, which are free to use for everybody. The problem is that they're limited to a lower power, so 2 watts or half a watt from 8 to 14. Or you can get your GMRS license, which is it's a 10-year license. It does not have an exam, and it costs $35 to pay to the FCC. With that, you can now automatically, with the power of money, broadcast at a much higher power on the same frequencies. Now, the standard output power of a Baofeng UV5R is 5 watts. But of course, without a GMRS license, it would be technically illegal to transmit at that 5 watts on these FRS frequencies, which is a fun little fact. So, and as you can see here, it also GMRS includes a couple of other frequencies, the R's, and they also have the broadcast of 50 watts, as well as actually a little bit larger bandwidth, but we're not going to get into that. So another option is a local repeater. This is basically another radio that's set up locally on a mountaintop or on a tall building in your city. And essentially what you do is your radio will talk to the repeater, and that repeater will repeat what it heard. And since it's up higher, it's up on a mountain, for example, it has a much further reach than you might if you're at your house. So pretty much as long as you can see that repeater, you can, as you can see from this cute little diagram, you can talk from your city up to the mountain down to the next city over. And so, for example, if you go to repeaterbook.com, that will show you can type in your address or your city near you, and it'll show all of the active repeaters in your area. It'll say whether they're VHF, UHF, there's some 1.25 meters or some 33 centimeter on there, but generally most of them are VHF or UHF. Some of them are in analog, some of them are in digital. We'll get to the difference of those later. What you will see is the downlink frequency. So if you were to listen to the repeater, it would be this frequency, the one that's listed. Then it will have either a plus or minus and then some number. That is the frequency that you would use to transmit to the repeater. And then sometimes it'll have a number in there, and that has to do with either the CTCSS, some tone stuff. But if you're super interested in that, you can go look up how to do that. There's lots of examples online. Unless it is a GMRS receiver, which I think there might be, or a GMRS repeater, which I think there might be one in the upstate South Carolina. You do need a ham license to talk on a repeater. However, and this is the case for all ham radio. It's perfectly legal to listen and receive any radio transmissions that anybody else does. You can listen to, it's the same way you can listen to radio, 101.1, or you can listen to the NOAA, the NOAA broadcasts. Same thing. So you can go on your local repeater and tune your UV5R to 443.125 and just listen in. And you'll hear lots of dudes talking about their radios, because that's pretty much what the only thing that hams like to do on the radio is talk about their gear. So band propagation, different frequencies perform differently in different environments. Super insightful, but there's a lot of magic space electrons that happen, and it gets a little complicated, and it doesn't really make sense a lot of the time. So let's talk about these lower bands. So these, you'll need a specific transceiver. So that's a transmitter and receiver transceiver. On 160 to 40 meters, you can expect to get from 0 to 500 miles at daytime and 1,000 plus miles at nighttime. Now you might be asking, how does it being a different time of day mean that I'm going to get a different transmit distance? And that is because of the ionosphere. So at different times of the day, the sun does different things with the ionosphere in the sky, and because of that, radio waves propagate differently, and that doesn't really make sense. But you can do some cool things, and we'll see kind of examples of that later on. 30 to 15 meters, you can get between 500 and 3,000 miles a day, and it's reduced at nighttime, which is the opposite of the previous one. And then 10 meters, that one is kind of a more local frequency, local being 50 miles. And then whenever the band is open, which is what they call it when it's the right conditions wherever the sun is. Here we have an HF setup. This would be a power supply, your transceiver, some wires and antennas. This is a Balun. It gets really complicated. There's lots of really old forums of people geeking out about all this gear. Antennas, some accessories like your microphone, and then this is a tuner. And then here we have examples of some wavelength or quarter wavelength antennas. So, I mean, if we're going quarter wavelength of 10 meters, it's 2.5 meters. So, I mean, you need a fairly large antenna. This would be something you throw up in a tree, and you need a pretty long piece of wire here for these antennas. So now we'll get to VHF and UHF, which is probably more applicable to a majority of people. This is your Baofangs or your HD1s or HD2s, Yaesu or whatever. This is going to be, with a general 5-watt output, you can get maybe 6 miles on 2 meter, maybe up to 15 with elevation. Now, what's important about the difference between 2 meter and 70 centimeter is how the transmissions are, how they propagate in certain environments. So generally 2 meter is going to work better in like a wooded environment. So if you're in the woods, and that's because the foliage attenuates, or it kind of it filters out the higher frequencies of 70 centimeters. Sorry, lower frequencies of 70 centimeters. The opposite is the case is for 70 centimeter. You're going to get a little bit less general distance, but it works better in urban environments. So if you're, that can cause issues if you're trying to use 2 meter in urban, or if you're using 70 centimeter in the woods. So what factors affect range? Again, like I said, it's antenna height and type, power output, terrain, solar conditions, time of day, and atmospheric conditions. It gets getting into the weeds of especially HF. You can do some crazy stuff with skipping off of the ionosphere. And then over here, you can see that all the different paths that a radio wave can take. It can diffract off of a building. It can reflect off a building. It can just go straight to it. It can scatter, and that can cause problems with multipath receiving. But we're not going to get into that. So I like this little diagram of all the different types of transmission paths, I guess. So there's a phenomenon called ground wave, and I think that has to do with like the resonant frequency of the Earth. It basically will kind of skim along the top of the Earth, but that's going to be in your like much lower frequencies. And then we have skywave, which I was just talking about. It reflects off the ionosphere. It has to do with the angle of attack when it hits the ionosphere and the certain time of the day and the number of charged particles, blah, 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 blah. But generally, that's going to be in your medium frequency, high frequency, and sometimes in your VHF, but generally that's going to be like your 10 meter, 6 meter sort of thing. Then there's a troposcatter, which isn't, that doesn't happen very often. I think that has to do, turbulence in the troposphere. It'll bounce off, but that's not super reliable. It's not, you don't want to be, banking on that. But the king of radio is line of sight. Because if you can see it, then you know that radio wave is definitely going to make it to its destination. So line of sight is key, which means that elevation is key. So the higher you are, the further you can see, because curvature of the Earth and whatnot. And I guess you're above other trees, you're above buildings, etc. So some digital modes. We talked about analog. That's simple. It's very. I'm not going to go into the differences between analog and digital, but essentially analog is just your voice is modulated either by amplitude modulation, which changes the amplitude of the signal, or it's frequency modulated. But super basic, your UV5R and any your $20 Walmart walkie-talkies. Actually, now saying that, it's crazy that you can get UV5R for almost the same price as those crappy FRS walkie-talkies. But those are all just analog, nothing special about it. Now, the interesting stuff that's coming out, not recently, but it's more popular now, it's more interesting, is the digital modes. There's a number of them. There's DMR, the D-Star, P25. That's what local law enforcement uses, and trunking and stuff. ADSB is what airplanes use to transmit their location and altitude and all that sort of stuff. So digital voice, that's going to be speech that's encoded into a data stream before it's transmitted, and it can be encrypted, whereas analog cannot be encrypted, just because it's just your voice modulated, whereas digital voice is encoded, and then you can apply an encryption to that encoded bit stream. However, it is illegal in ham radio to broadcast encrypted data without special licenses. There's almost always business licenses. So yeah, it is illegal to transmit encrypted ham radio. So don't do that. There's also digital text and data. This is pretty interesting because of radio is it's pretty garbly. It can get what's the word? It can get messed up as it's propagating through the air. But what's really cool about digital is that you can create these protocols that are super resilient to that, and so you can send super low power digital data, and it'll receive super well, even if it's super low power. And generally, this is done on lower frequencies, and that has to do with bandwidth, which I'm not going to get into, but essentially, you have better time doing it. It's also less likely to get have interference on those lower frequencies. Some examples of that are JS8 call or FT8. the JS8 call, if you've heard of S2 Underground's GhostNet, that's what the protocol that GhostNet uses. It's JS8 call. And so I have a video on that if you're interested, as well as a way to receive only, which doesn't require any licenses. And so here is an example of what JS8 call looks like. Essentially, you have your waterfall here. So this is going to be your data coming in, and it will decode that data over here. This is just a screenshot I pulled off Google. And you can send slowly. It's not a super fast, super high data transfer. It's pretty low data rate, but you can send information over the air pretty reliably. So that's a pretty neat tool. So what kind of hardware can we work with? So for example, you got the very ubiquitous Baofeng UV5R that operates on 2 meter and 70 centimeter. It's got an output power of 5 watts. It is cheap and it is, in quotes, reliable. It's nice to have a bunch of these, have them pre-programmed, and if you're having a neighborhood emergency or something, you just hand them out to your neighbors, and that way everybody can stay connected. It's pretty valuable. But again, it's only analog, so you're not going to be able to encrypt anything. You're not going to be able to send any data over that analog. Then we have the Alliance HD2 that can operate on 2 meter, 1.25 meter, and 70 centimeter. It also has 5 watt output, but it has the option to transmit on DMR as well as a bunch of different encryption algorithms up to AES 256, which is pretty cool. Again, transmitting on ham frequencies or transmitting under a ham license while encrypted is against the rules, but it's a pretty neat technology to have if the need arises. There's also a SDR, so that's a software-defined radio. It's generally, well, actually, I guess you can have SDR transceivers, but they're pretty expensive. But the main benefit of, for example, an RTL SDR, which is kind of super cheap, it's like $30. Plug it into your computer, and you can output that audio that it pulls into a bunch of different programs. It's super malleable. It can go from 500 kilohertz to 1.675 gigahertz. But again, it is receive only. And what's cool is that you can listen to anything. So I've received basically, I've done a bunch of things with it. You can receive air traffic, from ADS-B. So you can just have it set up and you can pump that into its own web server, and it'll basically show you all of the aircraft around you. You can receive local law enforcement P25 trunked data. You need 2 of them, but you can basically listen in on local police, even if it's trunked, which means that it's got 2 different frequencies that it's working with. You can decode DMR. You can listen to the radio, 101.1. You can throw it on there and it'll just, you just listen to it in your headset. So super versatile tool. There's a lot of really cool stuff. You can receive satellite imagery from NOAA satellites that are passing overhead. There's lots of different really cool things you can do with the SDR if you're interested. So and then lastly, we have the Meshtastic device. This is the RAK WizBlock. It's kind of the best one out right now. Not super expensive. That operates on 900 megahertz, so 33 centimeters. It's got 1 watt, cheap, encrypted, and it's mesh. So that kind of leads us to what is mesh. So Meshtastic is an open source software. It uses LoRa protocol, which is I believe it stands for long range. It's a super low power digital protocol. And that operates in the 915 megahertz band, which is an ISR band, which I think is it's like an open band. It's you can kind of do whatever on it in a certain frequency range. And it's got super long range. which is really cool. I think the current record is 205 miles. I think they did that on 2 mountain peaks in Italy, and it just like barely misses the curve of the Earth, which is pretty crazy because you can send pretty large text messages or data packets over this protocol. But again, it's a higher frequency, which means that line of sight is king for this sort of thing. You're not going to be skipping this off the ionosphere. It's also super low power consumption, super inexpensive, and as long as you're not transmitting as a ham license member, it's encrypted. And so down in the left here, you can see an example of a mesh network. And the way it works is that each one of these dots is a node, and each node, when it receives a message, if the message wants to be sent out a number, it's called a hop. It will broadcast that message to any of the nodes that it's connected to, and that's how it meshes. So you can, Green Bluff could talk all the way up to CTWP through, DB28, and then they go through 9180 through the UFO. That's just an example. With the right setup, you could very easily set up a mesh network that spans, an entire state. I don't know if Slim wants to chime in. I don't remember what his furthest ping is.
Sure. Really quickly, I put my node on my drone and put it up about 200 feet in the air, and I was getting pings a couple miles east of Charlotte and as far west as Knoxville. So if you have the right conditions, if you got good height, line of sight to see out to the next highest point, you can go several hundred miles across pings or hops, as Nack said.
Yeah. Yep. So it's kind of like the beacons of Gondor. You put it at the highest point, and you ping that one. It's a repeater network, so it's like it's just like the UHF repeater. But you can just send pretty decently large data packets over it, which is pretty cool. This is actually also the LoRa protocol is also what ATAC uses.
Hey, quick question.
Yeah.
Hypothetically, if you were to set up like a mesh device on a traditional like HF VHF antenna setup, like an actual physical antenna, would there be any interference, or would it all kind of just sort itself out in the airwaves?
Yeah, so that's actually a problem that we've been having trying to set up the repeater in Greenville. We were going to put it up on Paris Mountain, and they have like what, it was like a 100 watt or 200 watt radio up there for the radio station.
Yeah.
And it just gets wrecked. So we're looking.
That's what I was wondering. Like I know,
Yeah,
I know bigger radio towers have just a shit ton of energy going through them.
Yeah. So we're looking into, you can get bandpass filters that only allow certain frequencies. Interestingly enough, I was able to receive Slim's when he was up there with the repeater. I was able to receive from him, but he was not able to hear me, which kind of makes sense, if he's that close to the radio tower. So yeah, that's something to keep in mind, is interference from other sources. But that we did some testing with that bandpass filter, which only lets in 915 megahertz, and that seemed to help out. But yeah, generally, I mean, I think I know there's one on Mount Mitchell, because I've gotten that one from Greenville, which is crazy. Yeah, you pretty much just want to set up a repeater on every tall mountain, and then like the beacons of Gondor, you just ping from one to the other, which is really cool. Yeah, but to answer your question, probably, again, if you're not transmitting both at the same time, then it's fine.
Yeah, the scenario I had in my head was kind of like, because I was talking with Slim, obviously the mesh network, would be working to like a comms pace plan, and I've been like kind of half-ass researching the idea of like a do-it-all antenna. So maybe like a 75, not even, probably a 50-foot antenna set up on some property with, you know, your HF, your VHF, and your mesh device.
Yeah.
Being able to transmit and receive through that. And then, you know, ideally all the homies would have their own, you know, radio antennas, as unrealistic as that is.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, totally. I think the issue we had up on Paris Mountain was just that antenna's, you know, it's a radio. It's like a, you know, local radio antenna. It's kind of confusing because they're all radio antennas. But you know, that one's broadcasting all the time at like 100 watts, so it's going to drown out everything. But you know, if you're on your own property on your own 150-foot pole, you know, you're not going to be transmitting. And maybe while you are transmitting, it might interfere. But you know, generally in HF and stuff, you're not transmitting all the time. So while you're not transmitting, it would work perfectly fine.
Cool, thank you.
Yep. Yeah, and that leads us to a little bit of OPSEC things to consider, as well as a tiny bit of homework. So, you know, even every time you transmit, you know, your radio is sending out magic space waves in all directions, infinitely until it hits something and is absorbed. That means that every single one of your transmissions can be heard by anybody who has an antenna and is listening. And it can also be triangulated. There are entire clubs called Fox Hunter or Fox. Yeah, I think it's Fox Hunting. As you can see from this really epic picture, there's dudes that will run around and try to triangulate a signal. And they love finding people who do not have their license and getting them in trouble because they're sad hams and they have nothing better to do. So just be mindful that if you do not have a license, then you should not be transmitting. Wagging my finger at you. And if you do have your license, then you should follow all local or federal laws on the subject. But a good way to not be found, even if you are transmitting, say, without a license, hypothetically, is to not transmit a lot, right? Because they can't hear you when you're not transmitting. They can only hear you when you are. So that is something to keep in mind. And that goes for, you know, in a crazy situation where you're the only American left and the Russians are chasing you down with their attack helicopters, and you're trying to, you know, talk to somebody. So just keep that in mind that even if you're encrypted, they can still figure out where you're transmitting from. And you know, even in Ukraine, that's a big problem with the drone operators because the drone operators communicate with their drones through radio waves. And so, you know, you don't have to figure out what the drone operator is doing. You just send an artillery shell wherever that transmission is coming from. Another thing to keep in mind is pace plan. So that's your primary, alternative, contingency, and emergency communications. It's good to have that set up, like Red mentioned. Having maybe Meshtastic as part of your pace plan would be cool. Let's say you're on you're out in the woods with the boys and you are transmitting on your primary frequency, and then, you know, somebody else in the area starts transmitting on that because they're talking to their buddy back in, you know, whatever town. Well, you know, you don't want to be on their frequency and be ignoring them or, you know, be annoying them. So you can hop over to your alternative. Yep. So that's not really what we're getting into today, any of the tactical stuff, but having a pace plan for pretty much any situation is never a bad idea. Again, the legality of encryption, while your radio can totally do it, it's not legal to do so if you're on a ham frequency that includes FRS and GMRS. I mean, if you're in the woods and, you know, nobody hears it, does a tree fall? Who's to say? Yeah, just get up in the mountains and blast encrypted UHF at 100 watts and wait for these dudes to come hunt you down. A reminder that this kind of goes with the first one, that PTT does not stand for push to think. So kind of think of what you want to say before you PTT. just some general advice. Yeah, and then an area study / band plan. It's like I said earlier, it is legal to transmit on ham frequencies in a life or death situation. But if you do not know what your local frequencies are, then you're screaming into the void, most likely. Maybe not, but it's better to know those frequencies before you need them. So that's part of your area study. Yeah. Is there anything you want to add, Slimothy?
No, I think you've done a great job covering most everything. I do have one question, just kind of like for the masses. If you could explain the difference between encoding and encryption.
Yes. So, encoding, all digital modes. So DMR, D-Star, P25, ADSB, JSA call. These are all digital. These are all digital modes. So what they do is they take, for example, let's say you write out a text, and you want to transmit that to your buddy, which is a very simple thing to do for DMR. What that does is it converts that text into some digital packet that says, it'll have a header. It'll say I'm a text, and then it'll say what the text is, and then it says I'm done. Same thing goes with voice. So it'll take your audio from you talking, it'll convert that into some sort of digital encoding. So it'll be, a whole bunch of bits, zeros and ones that make up your voice, and then that will get using phase shift keying, which is very technical, it's super in the weeds, but essentially it encodes your voice into digital information, and then it broadcasts that into the world. And the reason that is not encryption is because you can use these digital modes, but you have to submit them. You have to basically you don't have to like submit it to the FCC and say, hey, I'm using NAC special digital encoding. You just have to like release it to the public, and I think there's certain groups that are like volunteer ham people, and you say, hey, I came up with a new digital encoding, and it's open source and anybody can use it, and there's no encryption, it's perfectly decryptable, and that's perfectly fine. Now, if you do that and nobody uses it and you're the only person that uses it, then essentially you have encrypted your thing, for free legally with the FCC. But the problem is if I take DMR and I add an AES 256 encryption onto it, and then I broadcast on my local repeater, that is not allowed, because you're using an encrypted data, digital voice on a known, on DMR, which is that's, yeah. So that's the difference between encoding and encrypting. What about SARNAG? Would this fall under life or death regarding ham transmitting? I'm a little rusty on SARNAG. One second. Let me, if you want to, can you explain that to everybody?
I don't. My buddy had brought this up a while ago. Search and rescue numerical encryption grid, something that we would set up for like encrypting map grid coordinates or other numerical portion.
No. So also another thing that is against the rules. Another rule against FCC regulations is that you cannot obfuscate your transmission. Be that through digital encryption, be that through using code words that only you and your buddy know. That is against the rules. Now, it's a little loosey-goosey, but it's anybody can go. If you're not encrypted, then anybody can go and listen. They can be like, hey, you guys are using secret code words. That's not allowed. And they can report you to FCC because they're sad. Another thing is there are common shorthand words like QSL, QSO, blah, blah, blah. They're all nerd stuff. But essentially, that's common shorthand that's accepted by the community. Yeah. Oh, also, yes. So like I said, you can encrypt if you have a business license. I think there are there's definitely regulations on that because they don't want people running around with encrypted because, I don't know, they're overbearing government. So that's, yes. Ryan, to answer your question about SARNAG, no, that is not allowed because you are obfuscating your transmission. Yeah. I mean, now if you're goofing around in the woods with the boys, and again, if a tree falls in the woods and nobody's around to hear it, did it really fall? So we have a little bit of homework. Sorry, we have a little bit of homework for you. First, I would assume that everybody here at least has a UV5R. If not, step one is to purchase one. They cost like $20 on Amazon, and you can go and piss off all of your local sad hams by just taping down the PTT button and playing music, which again is illegal. Don't do that. You're not allowed to broadcast music over the airwaves. But you should definitely have at least UV5R, if not like 5 of them. And if that's step 0, if you do have that, which I hope everybody does, then first step is first thing on the homework is to program your radio. You should have all of the NOAA channels. Those are those basically broadcast 24/7, and they broadcast all of the local weather around you. That's super nice to have. You should either have them memorized, which is ridiculous, but program them in and have those available. That's also a good way to test if your radio is working, because they literally are always broadcasting. And if you're in an emergency situation, it's nice to be able to have the weather or listen to local emergency broadcasts. You should also have all of the GMRS or FRS, I guess. The GMRS just because that's includes the other frequencies. You should have those frequencies programmed, because a lot of the times that's most people, unless you're a ham, you're just gonna it's very common to use those channels, because anybody who has a Walmart walkie-talkie can talk on those. What else? Local repeaters. You should have those in there as well, programmed. And again, that goes back to emergency preparedness. If something goes down, there are communities. There's community driven groups in the ham world that do like kind of like a emergency communications, like it's their hobby. So they do like monthly practice runs of emergency events, just to make sure that everything's working and if they need to pass on information. So having that, being able to listen to that, if anything, just being able to listen to that is super valuable. I think that's kind of all I can think of in terms of like needs for programming. Another one, this kind of ties into the first part, do an area study. Know your local repeaters. Know, that's really all I can think of in terms of an area study. Know if there's any mesh networks around you. Can you use that mesh network with Meshtastic? If you decide to get one, they're pretty cool. If you can set that up and you can communicate with people, across the city, that's awesome. It's basically texting. It's got an app. You literally can text people, across the city, using just radios, pretty neat. And I guess the third point is the same as the first two. Find a local repeater and just listen to it. You'll learn a lot about how, if you want to get into ham, which I guess is kind of cool.
Two questions real quick. Can you is there like a plugin for ATAC to tie in the mesh network for like the text channels?
Yes. Yeah, you can run ATAC through a Meshtastic node. It's actually one of the options when you're setting up Meshtastic is an ATAC node.
Okay.
So they're pretty well. They've been developed like basically side by side.
That's cool.
Yeah.
And second question was, do you happen to have a frequency/repeater list for the Carolinas area?
Yeah, so that repeaterbook.com. You can go to that website and type in your city, zip code, whatever, and that will come up with all of the local ones around you. Again, if you want to listen, just type in the frequency that's listed. So one of the ones in Greenville is 443-1125. That's a digital one. But so that's not going to work with the UV5R. But I think 443-125 is an FM one. FN being analog. So your V5R will work on that. And so yeah, you can type that in and that'll have all your local ones. Yeah. So program
I couldn't
radio,
help
do your
it.
area study, find your local repeater and listen. Sorry. What was that?
Oh, I was gonna say I couldn't help but thinking when you were saying just hold down the push to talk and play music. But what if you were to do that while you were driving? They couldn't triangulate you.
You'd be surprised.
These guys
There's some
But
people who have
then,
nothing to do.
you cut it off before you get to your ending point. You
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. No,
cut
totally.
About 5 minutes out and make them listen to horrible music.
Yeah.
The 3 men in this photo will find you.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
the 3 men, they may be 105 years old, but they will find you.
You have to drive different ways to work.
Yeah. I'd recommend not doing that. I mean, I guess there's nothing stopping you other than, high trust society. But yeah, totally.
No,
you totally could.
I wouldn't do that. I
Of
wouldn't.
course. Oh, no, of course. Yes. Yep. But again, if you're moving, you could transmit. You could go to New York City, just start transmitting and then leave. Yeah, I don't know how you get out of that other than shits and
That's
giggles.
awesome.
But
It was in New York City.
yeah, yeah. There's nothing. There's not. When you transmit on like a UV5R, there's not like a digital ID or like your serial number that's get broadcast with that. DMR does have that, but you input what it transmits. So I could set my my DMR ID to like 69420, and that's what everybody who would receive that would receive. It would say, oh, this guy's ID is 69420.
The worst you're gonna get is some social security collector asking you what your fucking call sign is.
Yeah. Well, and then you just don't respond. It's again, like I said, all transmissions can be heard and triangulated, but only if they're transmitted. Now, if somebody's already listening and you transmit, and they have 2 or 3 listeners up or sniffers, and they're already listening and you transmit, well, then they have you because that's how triangulation works. I guess you only need 2 as long as you're not. Anyway, nerd sniping myself. Yeah. So just don't be a dick. Easy peasy. People will yell at you. They will. If you go broadcasting, you're supposed to, you start with your call sign. Also, fun thing about ham, your call sign is completely public to everybody on the internet, and it has your name and your address. Yeah. So very public. Yeah, there's some people on Reddit who have their like call signs as like a tag on their user account. And I'm like, okay, well, I know where you live now, just kind of weird. So don't do that. Just know that your call sign, I'm not going to tell you mine because that would dox me, obviously. Yeah, so that's a fun fact about that. Yeah, cool. Any other questions?
Yeah,
Comments?
going back to the radio tower idea. I know part of avoiding triangulation is using something like a directional antenna.
Yes.
Could you fire up one transceiver to multiple different directional antennas and like have a way to select between which direction you're transmitting in?
So like a switch to a whole bunch of directional antennas?
Yeah.
Yeah, probably. I don't see why not.
I mean, I don't either, but we're talking about magic talk.
Yeah, no, it's definitely magical space waves. Yeah, you could have some sort of device that switches between, it's actually pretty volatile, but it's essentially just connecting a wire to your radio. So you could have something that switches between 6 different wires. There's definitely a lot more that goes into it because you have to do like impedance matching and all this like science crap.
You need to find an old telephone switch.
Yes, yeah, yeah, like a coax switcher.
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, as long as everything's set up properly, there's no reason why you wouldn't be able to do that. Yeah.
Also, what is impedance matching?
So impedance is the resistance to flow of an alternating current.
So ohms.
Yes, it is ohms, but it's for AC, not DC. And basically from I have a degree in computer engineering, but I don't remember this shit. Even looking it up, it's confusing. It's all just it's like circuits, except it's extra magical because it's like radiation. I don't know. Basically, it's you have to have the right resistance, or it's not as efficient as it could be. And that's bad for your propagation because more efficient means further distance, which sometimes you don't want, but you would just limit your output power.
Right, but I mean, your resistance wouldn't change if you're on the same frequency, right?
Your resistance wouldn't change if you're on the same frequency. I don't know what you mean. All I know is impedance matching is just making sure that your antenna is at 50 ohms of impedance.
Okay.
I don't know why. I don't know. There's like the balun that I mentioned earlier. That's a balance unbalance. It has something to do with impedance matching. There's like these. You can like if you have a Yagi antenna, which is like the directional antenna, like you'll see in like like an old TV antenna where it's got all the different wires in parallel.
Yeah.
You can have like some sort of capacitance. It's like a beta match or a gamma match, and it has something to do with like capacitance with the driving element. It's a whole bunch of like really complicated nerdy shit. Yeah,
Interesting.
yeah. Yeah, basically like I was building a Meshtastic Yagi antenna to see if that would help me reach the Paris Mountain repeater, which it did, which is pretty cool. But it basically was like, okay, when you're making this, just use a wire to connect the two elements. So it's essentially like this is a dipole. When the electricity comes in, there's the negative and the positive wire, right? And one of them goes on this piece and one of them goes on that piece. So they're not actually electrically connected. And that does, I don't know, magic space wave stuff. But this beta match, basically you take a wire about this far away and you connect it to this side, and then you like can vary the spacing of the wire to itself, and that changes the matching, like the impedance somehow. I don't know. It doesn't make any sense, but I basically like squeezed the wire together and it performed better. I don't know why, and that doesn't make any sense to me. But again, magic, that's why I have the picture of the wizard on here, because it literally is like doesn't make any sense a lot of the time. So yeah.
If your impedance is based on ohms of resistance, that makes sense, because the shorter the wire and the closer together the copper strands are, the less resistance it has. I think. I don't know.
Yeah, but it's like a shielded cable that you just like move closer together, and it has something to do with like the capacitance of the wire or something. I don't know. It's all silly magic stuff. It's not real.
Fair.
Yeah. Oh, also with HF, there's this thing called the skip zone. You can see in this picture. So like when you transmit, the angle of incidence, if it's shallow enough, it'll bounce off the ionosphere, which means that it misses this whole area. So when I was testing this out with FT8, which is like it's basically just to see how far you can transmit, and you just basically talk to someone. You say, "Hey, I'm at this location." They're like, "Oh, cool, I'm at this location," and then you're like, "All right, neat," and it's just to see how far you can transmit. I was transmitting out like 350 miles and getting responses, but then nobody heard me within that 350 miles, which is pretty interesting. There's an antenna called a near vertical incident skywave antenna, and basically what you do is you point the antenna at the sky and it bounces off the ionosphere and comes back down. So it basically just makes this skip zone super short, and that'd be good for like if you wanted to go like 10 to 50 miles on voice, which you can't, or maybe 10 to 100 miles, which you wouldn't be able to do with like UHF or VHF. So yeah, there's all sorts of cool things you can do. You can talk like to Japan at certain times of the day, which is crazy. Yeah, it's pretty wild. Lots of nerdy shit. So that's all I got. Unless there's any more questions, which I'm happy to answer. But hearing none, I think I will call this meeting to a close. Oh, geez, 39. Cool. Yep.
If y'all think of anything else, I've got a question: how do I program my Baofeng, or what cable do I need, or I have an HD1, it's not talking to my other Baofeng, or whatever. Feel free to reach out to Knack or myself. We'll get you the right information if we can.
Yeah, and also if you're interested, there's like a lot of online videos and forums and stuff, because I mean, as you saw, it's pretty complicated hobby. So there's plenty of really good stuff. Like Ham Radio Crash Course is a really good YouTube channel. But yeah, like Slim said, if you've got any questions, we will be happy to assist. So
Thank you, fellas.
that's all I got. Yeah, thanks for listening.
See you guys.